In this video, we will be replacing the driver's side exhaust manifold in this 2012 Ford F150. To prep this vehicle, I have installed wheel chocks behind the rear tires. I have set the parking brake. I have disconnected the negative battery terminal and covered up that cable just so it doesn't accidentally touch anything. I have raised the front of the vehicle and supported it with a variety of safety stands, and we have removed the driver's side tire. Our first objective is to remove the front inner wheel fender liner. This will give us better access inside the engine where we will be working at, and we can remove those mud guards. And that will reveal a couple extra 5.5 millimeter fasteners we can remove. And we have several wiring harness retainers that we can see the back side of. And we will make an attempt to remove that at this point. Our next objective is to drain the cooling system. So we're going to slowly open the coolant reservoir. Now your engine needs to be cold when you do this, or you could spray hot scalding coolant all over you. Through the passenger side wheel well, we want to locate the petcock for the radiator. This is identified as a small red knob, and there is a small spigot below it, and this is kind of hidden by one of those AC lines. And I'm going to feed on a length of hose to that spigot, and rotating that counterclockwise will open that up. And then I have that tube running into a bucket that I've cleaned out. According to the manual, if we can recover the coolant without contaminating it, we can reuse that coolant into the engine, pending the coolant is still in good condition. So we'll check this at some point down the road. And I am going to very gently blow some compressed air down that reservoir to help push through any residual coolant that might be sitting in those lines. And then I will close that petcock and remove my line. And then I'll also replace that reservoir cap. Now we did remove about 4.5 quarts of coolant. We'll keep this in mind towards the end of the repair when we have to refill the cooling system. And if we take a look at the engine bay, we want to locate the air cleaner outlet pipe. This is a Y pipe that goes to both the passenger side and driver side turbos. And we can see that where this Y's off, we have a clamp. And those 3 clamps holding this component on, I'm going to loosen and gently work that air cleaner outlet pipe off. I am then left with my left hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. This needs to come out next. And if we follow that air cleaner outlet pipe from on top of the engine, we can see where it connects up with the turbo. And on that turbo, we also have our left-hand turbocharger to charge air cooler pipe. Both of these have clamps that need to be loosened. And both of those fasteners are fairly accessible. Located in proximity to those pipes, I have a bypass hose that needs to be removed. This will give me a little more slack in the lines. Following my pipe up into the engine bay, I can see that we are interfering with the coolant line. So we can remove that. And to improve access, I'm just going to remove my whole airbox assembly with my coolant reservoir. Taking a look from the top of the engine, we can see our left-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. This is the one that runs to the bottom on the turbocharger. We can also see our left-hand turbocharger to charge air cooler pipe. This one runs to our cooling unit, and this is the middle tube on that turbocharger. And if we give these pipes a wiggle, they are a little bit loose. However, upon closer inspection, we are still connected on by one connection point. We need to work this one off next. And the way that this connection point works, we need to spring back the little plastic piece so we can wiggle that off. And at this point, we should be able to remove that left-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. And at this point, we want to shift our focus back to the turbocharger area. That turbo assembly looks like a kind of rounded, bubbled out piece of metal. And specifically, we are taking a look at the connection point between the turbocharger and the exhaust system. And if we take a look up in there, we do have a fastener on either side of this connection point. We will want to use some Amsoil metal protector to help aid in the removal process of these fasteners. We then want to remove the turbocharger wastegate tube, and this is most easily accessed by the top of the engine. If we take a look in through the driver's side wheel well and we look at that turbo area, we want to locate our coolant line going into our turbo. Now this fitting does have a C-clip that needs to be removed first. Using a pick or very small screwdriver, we can work that C-clip off of the coolant fitting, and we can work that coolant line off. You will want a drip pan because the remaining coolant will drain out. If we take a look to the backside and underneath the turbocharger, we can see another coolant line. This coolant line is removed in the exact same fashion as the previous one. Additionally, we have two T40 bolts for our oil lines. And these are accessed from underneath. They are a bit difficult to get to. And then we have one additional bolt. This is a bolt that goes through the mounting bracket for this turbo assembly, and this is also on the back side. Taking a look at the turbocharger assembly, we have three T50 bolts holding this in. We do want to apply some Amsoil metal protector to aid in the removal process. And if I set up my ratchet where I am reaching through the top of the engine, I can actually get pretty good leverage on the ratchet. At this point, the turbocharger is loose, with the exception of a couple additional lines that we need to remove. And we'll start with the bypass vacuum hose, as well as the turbocharger bypass valve electrical connector. And we can then work that turbo out. And we now have access to count our bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now we lucked out in that this bolt was not broken off. This is the one that typically will break off. And a little Amsoil metal protector will help these fasteners come out. And these will use a 13mm socket. And we can then remove that exhaust manifold once all of those fasteners have been removed. And we can then remove that exhaust manifold gasket, working it off of those stud bolts and out of the engine. And as I inspect the exhaust ports, I can see that the back one was obviously leaking exhaust, even though that back bolt was never broke off. We are going to clean the mating surface with some acetone. And when you do this, I do not recommend using any type of abrasives. And I'm pretty happy with the way that cleaned up. And then our next objective is to remove our remaining studs. There are 3 towards the right side and 3 towards the left side. And we will be using the double nut method to remove the studs from the engine block. This will take a while. I wanted to take a couple minutes and identify some parts and talk about them. I have my old driver's side manifold and my new driver's side manifold. Weight-wise, my old one weighs about 5 pounds, 15 ounces. And my new one weighs about 6 pounds, 12 ounces. So quite a bit more metal with this new one. If I compare the backs, my old one has 8 bolt locations and my new one has 11 bolt locations. Now, although the bolt had not broken off in the engine block, which is typically what happens, somehow this had come separated enough to where it was letting exhaust by, as we can see from the carbon deposits. This was also causing exhaust to get into the cab. Out of curiosity, I decided to check the surface to see if it was still true, and it was not. Thinking that it might just be dirty, I went ahead and scraped off all the carbon and cleaned it up with some acetone so I would have a nice clean surface. I tested it again and the same result. And I even checked it with a different straight edge and the same result. So either this is warped or there is just very poor manufacturing. Comparing my old and new gaskets, they look about the same. Taking a look at the turbo, this is in the orientation that we saw it on the vehicle. The large diameter pipe on the bottom left is the left-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. And this pipe runs from the turbocharger up through that Y pipe fitting and into our airbox. This then has a bypass hose that is connected from that pipe up to the top left port. The middle location on the left is our left-hand turbocharger to charge air cooler pipe. And this pipe will go from our turbo all the way through to the cooling unit. Towards the bottom right, we have our exhaust flange. There are 2 stud bolts. This is what connects up to our exhaust system and that catalytic converter. We can also see the 3 mounting bolts holding the turbocharger on. Towards the top, we have our wastegate canister that had our wastegate tube hooked to. And right in the middle on the front, we can see one of our coolant line connection points. And that coolant line is connected to both the turbo as well as the back of the engine. And if we flip it around, looking at the back side, we can clearly see the bypass tube location as well as that wastegate tube location. On the left there we have our exhaust flange with the 2 stud bolts. Now we can also see that additional coolant line location as well as 1 additional mounting bolt location. This one was up, back, behind, kind of hidden so you can't see it. And then flipping it on its back, we can see the location that had the oil lines, and that does have a gasket that we will replace. Our mounting bolts behind there also has a gasket, and we can clearly see that coolant line location, which is located directly on the back, which you cannot see unless you crawl under the vehicle. And then of course that 1 additional mounting bolt holding this on. And then flipping it back to the front, we have that 1 bypass vacuum hose as well as the bypass valve electrical connector. We're going to begin reassembly by installing the new studs. We are putting the shorter thread end into the cylinder head first, and we can work our way through putting each bolt in. This does take some time. You want to make sure you do not cross thread it, and I like to work from the front of the vehicle towards the firewall or towards the back of the vehicle. And each of these will be torqued to 8.8 foot-pounds. We can then install the new manifold gasket, making sure that it gets seated fully all the way around. That can be followed by the new manifold, again seating that fully. And then we can hand tighten each of the spacers and manifold nuts, again making sure you don't cross thread them. With all of the manifold nuts in place, we need to tighten these in a 3-step sequence. First to 14 foot-pounds, then to 18 foot-pounds, and then double check it at 18 foot-pounds. Now we also have a sequence for all 11 manifold nuts. This will ensure that the torque is evenly applied to the opposing manifold nuts. It is also worth noting that every time you put an extension or universal joint on your ratchet or torque wrench, it will skew the torque specifications of the wrench setting. We are going to do just a little bit of prep work before installing the turbo back onto the vehicle. We're first going to switch out the turbocharger gasket to turbo mounting flange. We're also going to be switching out the gasket for our oil line connection. And then I'll also be switching out those 2 coolant fittings. And as we do this, we want to be very gentle. We want to start these by hand to make sure that we don't cross thread them. And we will come back and torque each of these to 13 foot-pounds. And if installing a new exhaust flange gasket, now would be the time to do that as well. And with a couple threads of each bolt, I can hold my new oil line gasket in place. And we can apply a little bit of grease to those coolant fittings. This will help them seat easier. And we're going to add just a little bit of oil into those oil lines just to aid in the initial startup after we complete the repair. And at this point, it is just a matter of putting everything back together. First, the turbocharger. I like to start with 1 of the mounting bolts, started by hand. I can then add the additional 2 mounting bolts, started by hand. I have my 2 bolts for my oil line, both of my coolant lines, and we can give it a little pull. If it pops out, it's not seated correctly. If it sticks in there, we're good to continue on. We have our mounting bolt on the back side, as well as our exhaust flange bolts. Our electrical connection comes next, as well as that bypass hose, our wastegate hose. And with everything reconnected on the turbo, we can move on to our larger components. We can get that bypass tube in place. And all of the other components that we removed, we're just going to work back through the reverse order and double check and triple check to make sure that we have connected all of our lines to everything. And tighten up any remaining connections or clamps. And at this point we are looking pretty good, so we're going to reconnect that battery and tighten that down on the terminal. At this point I have everything reinstalled except for the wheel well covers and the tires, of course. I'm going to refill the cooling system and do a visual inspection for leaks. If all is good, I can start the vehicle and again check everything for leaks. And when we first start it, there might be a light amount of smoke as we have sprayed chemicals on this, put grease on this, and we do have new components that need to run through the heat cycle. Now, as we wrap this repair up, I do recommend doing an oil change. I do recommend doing a coolant flush because we have effectively exposed both of those systems. I also recommend cleaning your braking system as you probably touched the rotor and other components. And aside from that, we can install that wheel well, put the tire back on, and take it for a test drive.